what are your favorite parts of this EO?
Sure. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. So there's a lot to take in. I'm especially excited about Section 7, which is advancing equity and civil rights in a number of manifestations. It talks about civil rights in the criminal justice system, as well as government benefits and programs, and civil rights in the broader economy as well. I think it's very powerful to see language around promoting the equitable treatment of individuals and adhering to the federal government's fundamental obligation to ensure fair and impartial justice for all, specifically given the incredible power of these systems to advance existing inequities in this space. And a lot of this order builds on the AI Bill of Rights, spearheaded by former White House OSTP Director Alondra Nelson. And I think you can see that connection very closely in this particular part of the executive order.
Thanks, Theo. And I take it back. My favorite section is also Section 7. David, what do you think?
Well, I love Section 7 too, but since that's already been taken, I really like that the term dual use is a big part of this executive order. I've been using this term for months, and even in meetings with the White House, when I talked to them about what I thought was important here, I brought that up. And, I think this is one of the first times when we have a major US government document use the term dual use that applies it to artificial intelligence. And I'm excited about that. That happens all throughout Section 4, but in particular, I really like 4.6 that talks about gathering input on dual use foundation models with widely available model weights, which is a brilliant new term for what I've been calling open source asterisk AI models for a long time. So it's unwieldy, but I think it's really helpful. I'm really excited about the 270-day period that opens up for conversation.
I agree. Dual use, very important for national security. Alexis, what do you think?
So I have to say it's Section 4.5, reducing the risk posed by synthetic content. Really, it's so nice to hear the government talk about misinformation, watermarking, and other systems that we can use to actually identify AI. This has been such a big issue, and I think the fact that we're opening up the conversation to figure out different mechanisms to actually approach this as we're getting ready for elections, as we're looking at information coming from war zones that are just not accurate, having mechanisms and having the government take the lead on this is actually, it's quite surprising. And I'm actually hopeful because that means that they're paying attention to what's happening in real time.
I agree, especially the keyword. You mentioned the keyword elections. 65 elections worldwide. That's so important. So thank you for mentioning that. Are there any least favorite parts of the EO that you don't necessarily like, agree with, or anything lacking in there? Theo, I'll go back to you.
Sure. So I think the biggest concern that I have here, or one of the concerns that I've been hearing about specifically, is centered on the issue of regulatory capture. So it's not a specific issue with the executive order itself, but rather the idea that the cumulative effect of so many new regulations will be unfairly burdensome to smaller, nascent AI-focused companies that are developing right now in industry. And so we've already seen that with GDPR, there has been a rather well-documented effect of creating unfair competition environments for small and medium-sized businesses operating in this space. And so I'm hopeful that this executive order doesn't unintentionally backfire and actively undermine competition in this space, because we do want to see a competitive market environment. And so that's one of the concerns that I've been hearing about in industry right now.
David, I saw your hand up.
Yeah. Well, let's see. I think it's always good to have disagreement on panels like this. So I hear Theo's point there, but I also think this does open up a lot of opportunities for new types of businesses, new types of startups working in the AI governance space, impact assessment of AI systems, AI auditing, AI ethics. And that's not just lawyers and policy people, there's also a lot of serious technical engineering operations work that needs to get done to make a lot of the items in this order implementable for companies and for government as well. But the thing I am a little bit unhappy about. I understand a lot of things in this order are really big asks of government agencies and of industry, but with the 2024 election around the corner, it just feels like there's so many deadlines set out, but sometimes they're 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, 270, 540 days out before we actually see the results. And in some cases, the results that we're going to have to wait half a year or a year from now or more for are just reports that will then be guidance for what then happens next. And I'm thinking about elections.
Yeah, Alexis, I see you nodding. Do you want to say anything, or is that just agreement?
It's agreement with David, but I think it's also important to know it's an executive order, right? And so anything can happen after the upcoming elections. And to David's point, the amount of reports that we have right now, the amount of convenings that we have right now, we need implementation. And I'm sure we'll get to this later, but it's a wonderful foundation, but it just doesn't have any teeth, which is also very worrisome. So.
I feel this personally because not only am I a former Fed, so I feel for my former colleagues in government, but I also know that that EO is no replacement for actual legislation. And as someone working in the Senate right now, I feel like, all pressure is on us now. But that is actually a great segue into my next question, because this executive order, despite it not having any teeth and not being a replacement for legislation, is going to have a huge impact on industry. And so I want you guys to talk about what are the biggest impacts that this executive order will have on industry. And I also want you to differentiate between the impact that it's going to have on large companies versus small companies. So please, Theo, I'm going to go back to you. Please, what
Yeah,
are
so I think the impacts will be profound. We're already starting to see some of them, and the impacts will just accelerate. So these include increased investment in AI research and development because the executive order directs the federal government to invest in additional research. This will obviously result in new technologies, which will boost innovation directly in industry. And we're already seeing this, but we expect that this will advance the adoption of AI by businesses and generate new jobs and industries, just as David was suggesting earlier. So, for example, I was just at HealthWorks, a studio here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, HealthWorks Fitness, and they were talking with me about how they're leveraging AI to identify what customers are most likely to cancel their membership and what customers they might be able to offer additional benefits to. And I think that the executive order will amplify a lot of these innovations. And then I think it'll also bring additional attention to AI ethics and safety. There's a huge amount of language across the executive order that's focused on developing AI in a responsible and ethical manner. And so this will likely increase attention on issues like bias, privacy, and security in AI development and deployment.
I love that. I love that. I think we need more focus on ethics, responsible development of AI. I agree. David, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that there are going to be huge impacts on any company that is selling AI services to government, and that's going to unfold over the course of the next year or more. But basically, any company that is already or wants to sell these services will have to do a lot of work to demonstrate that their services fit within the guidelines, that they're fair, that they're unbiased, and that they don't have safety harms. Another one is for the big companies out there that are training the dual use foundation models that I referred to earlier, or what you sometimes called the frontier models, the really big models. Like your Chat GPTs and your Google's Palm or Anthropic's Claude. The next generation of those models is going to have some significant reporting requirements to the federal government, and they're going to have to demonstrate that their models have gone through a number of different types of safety testing. They're going to have to share their plans for development of those models with the federal government, and they're going to have to comply with guidance that's going to come from NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology within the Department of Commerce. And NIST has been working for years to develop guidelines for how to manage risks of AI. So it's, you know, a lot of people are bringing up this executive order might have negative impact on small businesses, but I do think there's a very big additional requirement, some might call it a burden, on the companies developing these really big models that I think is very important, because these companies have had little to no supervision so far in the development of these incredible, world-changing, very impactful technologies.
See, that's very interesting. And I think the government setting the stage for this also means that there's going to be huge impact for the government itself. And we talked about it a little bit on the government workforce. They're going to have to produce this reports, 30 days from now, 90 days from now. But what other impacts do you see for the government that are separate from this reports, right? Like, what other consequences will we see coming for the government? Theo.
Sure. So one of the ways I think this executive order is most exciting is that it really can facilitate improved government services. So AI can be used to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of government services. For example, it can be used to automate tasks, improve decision-making, and also personalize services to citizens. So we anticipate that this will lead to the adoption of AI by government agencies at all levels. For example, agencies might be interested in identifying which of their constituents are most likely to benefit from a particular service. And on the other side, this could also facilitate better government oversight and regulation. So government agencies that are looking to detect fraud and abuse, identify risks, and enforce regulations can leverage AI systems to identify organizations that are most likely to engage in fraud and abuse, for example. We also expect that it'll increase transparency and accountability in government. So it can, for example, monitor government performance and collect feedback from residents, and also yield more informed policymaking, because AI can be used to analyze data, identify trends, and then predict outcomes in a way that could be used by government stakeholders really at all levels.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the government will have to get it together so that they can hire the right people, they can compete with the private sector, they can attract a tech-savvy young workforce. The government is really going to have to get it together. David, what do you think?
I agree with your last point. Hiring is a really big one. A lot of agencies are going to have to now appoint or hire new chief AI officers, and those officers are going to have a lot of responsibility within their agencies. They're going to have to talk to each other, and that's going to be important. And I think also just that this idea of what they refer to in the order. There's also, if you really like this executive order and you read the whole thing and you can't get enough and you want more, you should then read the OMB guidance on, this is draft guidance issued by OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, about how to effectively implement this order in a bunch of different agencies. And so in that draft guidance, it talks about, as well as in the executive order, the idea of safety impacting and rights impacting AI. And this idea of assessing AI to figure out if it could potentially impact people's rights and a really expansive notion of people's rights is very important. And I think there's going to be a lot of work to do on that from government agencies. Oh, we can't hear you, sorry, Belle.
Alexis, is there anything you'd like to add to this?
Yeah, I think, to the point of hiring, one of the things that's been affecting the government is they just don't have the talent. And part of that actually comes from the immigration system. So this actually does force the US to reevaluate what we're doing with visas. when it comes to attracting new talent, but then also bringing people into the government. As a former government employee too, recovering U.S. Senate, pay, expertise. We need these people coming from the tech industry to actually help build whatever these mechanisms are going to be. So I'm really interested in that. And in terms of civil rights, Meta is still the only company that has a VP of civil rights. And so when I think about the criminal justice system, when I think about civil rights, social rights within the US, we still have a long way to go. And so this technology will actually help hold the government to account in a way that hasn't been possible. Right. And so I do see this as a really big win for civil rights communities in a way that I don't think they thought was possible when they started talking about redlining, right, and technology a few years ago. So I think this is a really big advancement to a lot of the work that's being done right now.
Agreed. Thank you for that. Now I would like to talk about something different. There's a thing out there in the EU. It's called the EU AI Act. It's that huge law that they're still trying to work out. How will this executive order, how does it relate to the EU AI Act? What are some similarities, differences? What do you see? What are the synergies that you see there? I'll start with Theo again.
Sure. Yeah. So, and before jumping into the differences between the EUA Act and the U.S. Executive Order, it's also worth mentioning that there are a lot of frameworks at play here. So there's also the OECD AI principles, the UNESCO recommendations on the ethics of AI, and the G7 Hiroshima process, which is underway and set to establish guardrails for advanced AI systems at the global level. I'll just throw in a plug. So I'm working with a nonprofit called Partnership on AI, and I'll put this in the chat. We recently had a global forum on AI, and interoperability was a theme that was widely discussed at the conference. Folks are very concerned about how interoperability will exist, will manifest between all of these frameworks at the global level. But in the context of these two specific pieces of regulation, so there are differences in scope, approach to regulation, and also enforcement. So the U.S. Executive Order has enormous breadth. It applies to all AI systems that are deployed or used by the federal government, and certain systems deployed or used by companies that pose a serious risk to national security. And the EU AI Act applies to all systems that are placed on the EU market or used to provide services to EU residents, regardless of where those systems were developed. So there's a little bit of a difference vis-a-vis scope. There's also a bit of a difference in terms of the approach. So the executive order adopts a risk-based approach focused on regulating some of the higher risk AI systems, and the AI Act prescribes specific requirements for all systems within its scope. And then I think David will get to this too, but there's an enforcement difference. So the executive order excludes explicit enforcement provisions, while the AI Act includes a number of enforcement mechanisms, including fines and penalties for businesses that fail to comply with its requirements. So there are quite a few differences between the two.
The EU loves fines. David, what do you think?
Yeah, I think the fines are definitely meaningful. I'll just remind you the Federal Trade Commission in the U.S. also loves fines. Fined Meta $5 billion. So, not just the EU. I think this is going to be a really odd patchwork for a while. And I was actually talking to some colleagues at the European Commission yesterday, and I asked them, they were asking me, what do they need to know about the executive order in the U.S.? And I asked them, do you guys have the equivalent of an executive order in the European Union? Is there a thing? And we talked about it for a while. One of them was a lawyer. There's not exactly an equivalent thing. Our systems are just different. And so we're going to have this situation where we have a executive, probably the EU AI Act will pass in the next few months, maybe as early as December 6th. They'll finish the negotiations. But it's not scheduled, at least the original draft of it from last year. It's not scheduled to go into effect for 2 years from when it's signed, but there's also talk of accelerating that. In any case, it's going to take a while for both of these to fully go into effect with all the slew of different timelines in the executive order and delays for the EU-AI Act. But at some point, once they're both in effect, we're going to have executive branch rules from the United States, which is a very important international body, and then we're going to have legislative impacts from the EU, and those won't always fit together in clear ways. And I do think it's important to note, in addition to the EU AI Act being legislation, which gives it a lot more power to regulate what private industry does, the executive order goes beyond what usually an executive order can do by using something called the Defense Production Act. And that's a law from 1950 that allows for the executive branch, when national defense is concerned, to take actions that might not normally be allowed of the executive branch. But even so, the UAI Act is going to be more powerful because it's legislation, and also more durable because executive orders can be fully repealed by the next administration or partially repealed. And it's also, a really interesting one for me too, is that both of these, the executive order and the EUAI Act, are talking about open source, and they both, at least in the current draft of the EUAI Act from the European Parliament in June of this year, it's not quite clear how both of them are going to deal with open source AI systems. So that's something where it may be that the EU kind of effectively supersedes the US by finalizing that work on how it applies to open source before the 278-day period that the executive order kicks off.
Yeah, thank you. I want to be mindful of time, and I want to take us to the next question. I see many opportunities for civil society. And so I want to start with Alexis, and I just want to ask, what opportunities are there for civil society organizations? And I'm sure people in our audience will appreciate your thoughts on this.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great opportunity. Like civil society organizations have been pressuring governments or asking governments to create regulation or some type of framework around AI and social media, right? Like this conversation's been happening for a while. And unfortunately, the EU was the only one to actually create something. China created something, right? And recently the G7 came out. So there is a lot of momentum, but for right now, CSOs can hold the governments accountable, but they can also conduct their own research, right? They can also be part of the implementation. They can be part of forcing or creating the frameworks in which we think about transparency and reporting and risk assessment framework, right? And so like there are very tactical things that these organizations can do. And I think the good thing is that the US is part of all of these multilateral charters, right, that are going on, right? And so I think it's also really important to understand that just because the US has one standard doesn't mean that another country is not going to be focused on implementing the same things. And so the G7 just agreed on a set of principles, which I think is very important. And so when we're thinking more broadly, we can think about, okay, what is Japan going to do? And what Japan does is probably going to closely mirror what the US does, right? And so I think that there are a lot of important steps to take. And also the UN is doing a lot of really good and interesting work around creating UN advisory councils around AI. So this is a time for CSOs to actually step up and become vocal and use their expertise to hold these governments accountable. I think it's a really unique time that we haven't seen, and it's all taken place in the span of the past 2 weeks.
Sounds good. I want to hear from Theo, because you're very involved in a lot of things, civil society, and I just want to hear from you.
Sure. I love that intro. Yeah, I mean, 100% +1 to everything Alexis just said. I think that civil society can play a really critical role in conducting its own research, but also in being in conversation with government. So for example, I just threw in the chat, so a week ago, there was the UK AI Safety Summit. And if you look at the LinkedIn post that I shared, Alex Givens, who heads the Center for Democracy and Technology, was there alongside other representatives from civil society. And so you can see how civil society is meant to play a very active role in what's going on. And I'll also note that at the policy forum that Partnership on AI recently organized, we had stakeholders from all sectors present, including federal government agencies. So our US government counterparts were from CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, and also NTIA at the US Department of Commerce. So we were in conversation about issues like interoperability and standards and prioritization and even defining AI safety with government at a cross-sector, multi-stakeholder conversation just a few days ago. So yeah, there are a lot of ways for civil society to plug in. And I think in some ways, most importantly, civil society can be the bridge between government and the public, because the public right now is very frightened about what's going on. Understandably, there's been this massive proliferation of a new technology that many people are talking about in the context of existential frontier risk. And so civil society has the unique function of having these trusted relationships with the public in a way that they can build trust and confidence and educate the public on how to use AI responsibly and effectively.
I agree. And I think civil society is the voice of the public. And I've seen them all kinds of organizations being involved in the Senate AI Forum. I see them, across the spectrum of society. So they're well represented, and they're going to play a very important role in this. Okay, let's move to another topic now. Do you believe that this executive order will stifle innovation? There's people from different industry and companies that are saying that this EO will stifle innovation and that we should not be regulated. This should not have passed. This shouldn't have come out. What do we think of that? And I'll leave it up to you, to whoever wants to take this.
I could jump in since I was the one who brought it up in the first place. No one can predict the future. At least I have not yet figured out how to do that. And so we don't know exactly what will happen, but the concern that I've heard referenced amongst many members of industry in this space is that this kind of new regulatory requirement across all of its forms creates real barriers to industry sector activities, specifically for organizations that are smaller and looking to scale and haven't yet built up the systems that they would need to have in place to be in compliance with these kinds of regulations. So, for example, I read about it in the context of New York, where new legislation on AI in the context of hiring is creating a backlash amongst some employers, saying that they can't meet these requirements, that they don't have the capacity to do the work that's required by the legislation at the state level. So there has been some conversation about whether this could unintentionally fall prey to regulatory capture, but that has yet to be seen.
Well, now I want to. David, I think you want to.
I was just going to drop one name of one startup, Credo AI. They're one of the leading startups working on AI governance, and they're bringing in investment. They are growing. They are hiring, and I mentioned it before. I think AI governance, AI auditing, responsible AI in general, these are going to be new areas that will be ripe for investment, that will require new talent that are happening because of this executive order, not in spite of it.
Agreed. And I am getting certified on AI auditing. So yes,
that's awesome.
I want to flip this question now. Is this executive order strong enough? You have people on the other side of the spectrum saying that this did not go far enough, that's not enough. What do we think? David, let's go back to you.
It's stronger than I expected. I had heard of the Defense Production Act, and I had heard some speculation that was a tool that could theoretically be available, but I really didn't expect that to be used in the executive order. I'm happy that it was, because if you look at the United States Congress, It could barely pass a budget. We might be headed for another shutdown soon. And yeah, I mean, sorry, well, if you were in charge, maybe it would be different. But yeah, we need regulation, and whether that regulation comes from an executive order or from Congress, ideally it would be great if it came from Congress very soon. It's just I look and I don't see it, and so I don't see it happening soon, despite the wonderful AI Insight forums that Schumer has been holding, despite the incredible work of Senators Blumenthal and Hawley putting proposals together, holding hearings. Like it's everyone I know who knows a lot about Congress is telling me, like, don't hold your breath. Don't move to Washington, D.C. if you care about this issue, is the message I got. So sorry, yeah, don't take that personally. It was just, I'm in San Francisco and I care about this a lot. And I really asked people, I was like, if this is the issue I care about most right now, do I need to go to DC to work on this to make a difference? And people said, well, I don't know if anything's going to happen over there. So I was excited about the EO.
I want to hear from Alexis. I haven't heard from her in a little bit, so I want to hear from her.
Oh, David, you are hilarious. No, it's not enough. It doesn't have teeth. And to be quite honest, it's literally just a copy paste from everything that we've seen from every other country. So I'm happy. Sorry, that's really harsh, but
I like it.
but I'm happy that the White House put something out, right? I'm happy that they took steps forward, right? Congress, as David said, they can't do anything right now. So it really is up to the executive to be able to use their powers. But I think we should focus on states, right? And so there are a lot of states creating legislation that's focused around AI. I think, yes, we're coming up into another election cycle. And yes, we had election day yesterday for a number of states. These states are focused on technology in a very real way where they can use their state legislators or legislation to create actual legislation that works, that means something. So I think we just need to stop waiting on the federal government to save us and focus on the states, because that's what they've been doing, right? The Colorado and California AGs, they have more backbone than the current elected members of Congress and the Senate right now. So I think it's a good start. I think it's a good framework. It's nice to know that they're listening to civil society and that they're paying attention to what other countries are doing, but it's not enough, and it won't be enough until we start seeing things aside from reports that will come out in 180 days, 250 days, or whatever the timelines are. So yeah, no, it doesn't have, it's just not good enough.
If I can I amend my answer, Sorry, Bill?
Sure.
Okay, so totally agree with everything Alexis said. I think I was thinking of, like, as an executive order, is it strong enough? And so for me, it's like, as an executive order, it's hard for me to imagine it going much further. Is it enough? No, not at all. Like, we need legislation. Legislation's probably going to come from the EU first. So agree with all your points, Alexis.
I will. Oh, sorry. I was going to say, China is actually leading right now on AI regulation. We're in competition with China, but they really did take the first stab at it. And even though I don't agree with most of what's there, it actually is holding companies accountable in a way that I think we only wish we could, right? Different governments, different set of X, Y, and Z, but China took the lead. And so we are playing catch up. But David, this is the highest thing. This is the strongest thing that the US can do right now. So it's good enough for what it is. I agree. Yeah.
And I'll follow up on that. But before I move on, I want to let Theo express her opinions on this.
Yeah, I mean, just a +1. I think that Alexis nailed it. The executive order is part of the process, but it isn't everything. We need good legislation. And because of the way things are right now at the federal level, we are increasingly seeing legislation in AI, but also across tech, all tech policy issue areas proliferating at the state level, which back to interoperability presents a lot of challenges for industry when they're trying to comply with one federal level framework, that's a bit easier to do. But when you're complying with up to 50 different frameworks at each state level, that presents a lot of challenges logistically for companies. So it definitely creates some compliance issues, but it is very much the trend that we're observing. I'll put a few notes in the chat too. I've been tracking some legislation in this space, so I'll put some resources in the chat for folks also.
Good. I have one last question, but this one is going to be a little long, so I want to make sure that we have enough time for all of us to kind of answer this question. So a lot of people out there are saying that, including yourselves, legislation is needed, and that part of this executive order's mandate is to generate ideas for legislation. So I want to ask all of you, what do you think are the most important legislative measures that Congress should be working on? And I can also add a few things, but I don't know if either one of you wants to start. I can go first, or you can go first.
I'm
You go
happy
for
to
it.
jump in, or you can.
Yeah, well, okay, I'll start and then I'll jump in again as I see fit. So the first one is high-skilled immigration. I'm a former foreign service officer, and I dealt a lot with visas and H-1Bs and J-1s, and I saw a lot of text here addressing that. And so I think Congress is going to really have to get it together and pass some laws that address, if not reform the immigration system, at least address this H-1B high-skilled immigrants that we need to come to the U.S. and work on this very important sector. Having said that, I don't think that high-skilled immigration should be a substitute for us upskilling our workforce and bringing more underrepresented minorities and marginalized communities into this high-paying jobs of the future. So I think Congress is going to have it has its work cut out for itself. So that's one thing. The next one is government procurement. I have sat in many panels where companies want to bring this cutting edge tech to the government. But when it comes to what about the workforce, both in the government and their own workforce, like cloud engineers and procurement and contracting officers, they don't have enough people to do the work. So there's a disconnect there, and I don't know how else to fix it other than government, Congress passing laws to increase the number of U.S. citizens going into these professions. So I'll stop there and I'll pass it to Theo and see what you think are those most important legislative measures.
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of concerns or a lot of thoughts that are on my mind. I think concentrated market power is something that keeps me up at night. There's been a larger conversation around antitrust, and it's something that was advanced in the last session, but unfortunately didn't move forward. So thinking about market power as well as privacy violations, discrimination in all of its forms, which is something we've talked about, and the proliferation of misleading content, including deepfakes and shallow fakes, is something that we've touched on in this conversation. But I also wanted to highlight. I also wanted to highlight design considerations. So something that the Integrity Institute had a session on just a few days ago was on dark patterns. And so thinking about how users are prompted towards specific choices in the context of their engagement with these systems because of design choices made by engineers in the design process is something that I think merits further conversation as well.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to pass it on to David.
Yeah, one of the things that keeps coming up in hearings in Congress is this idea that we failed to regulate social media, so we got to get it right this time on AI. And I want to respectfully dispute that idea. So I don't think it's that we failed to regulate social media. I think that it is that we are continuing every single day to fail to regulate social media. And social media is one of the biggest technologies that underlies social media and makes it work is AI. AI distributes content that can encourage people to commit suicide. It can distribute content that makes children develop various mental health issues. It can distribute massive amounts of misinformation. And I really strongly feel that when Congress does get around to taking action on AI, they should really think about AI and one of the biggest attack surfaces that AI, can be used to attack as also social media, with deep fakes. Theo already talked about that. One other thing that I think it's important to mention also is energy efficiency and climate change. AI is incredibly resource intensive, and I think I was a little bit disappointed to not see that mentioned in the executive order. I would like to see legislation address requirements for transparency, disclosure, and work for AI companies to make these applications less energy intensive.
Amen to that last one. That is very important. Very important. And I see Theo dropping a lot of links on the chat, and I'm wondering if we can, like after we close down, if we can gather all those links and then share with the public. And Alexis, I know that you work for Meta. What are your thoughts? Deep fakes, a lot of issues, social media regulation. What are your thoughts on this?
All the things, all the things. You know what? I'm going to do a +1 to what Theo and David mentioned about deepfakes and misinformation. It goes back to watermarking. It also goes back to like understanding provenance and then creating like an industry standard when it comes to enforcement of this type of content. And so like that's not something necessarily that we can create legislation around, even though I believe Colorado is trying to introduce some watermarking legislation, but it's something for us to consider. And what I'll say is that these tech companies, or when I was at Meta, I'll use Meta as an example, we really wanted regulation. We would go around and say, like, please regulate us. And I think it makes it easier for tech companies to figure out what they should do and pour resources into when there are like strict regulations that say, okay, well, you need to invest more money into, I don't know, creating X, Y, and Z policies, right? Therefore, we end up hiring back trust and safety talent, right? And so like that's just one example. So, and also tech companies, like they are constantly battling, human rights versus profit, right? And so until you take that off the table, the best bet in terms of helping human rights and child safety and stopping terrorists from being recruited online, it really is government regulation, sadly. And then we're coming up in elections, right? So we have over 30 global elections that we need to be worried about as a society right now. And the US is always the biggest, right? We're all US based. But if we cannot handle election integrity, if we can't create legislation around that on the state level or on the federal level, then we just end up creating a vacuum for bad actors to continue to play. And that's something that should actually come from our governments. We should not, these companies should not be in charge of our political processes and ensuring democracy prevails in terms of elections. But, the government has mechanisms. Legislators can agree on some things, but I think the most pressing has to be elections, and then we can focus on everything else. But whatever allows these tech companies to bring back trust and safety professionals back into the fold, I think is helpful. Too many people have been laid off over the past 2 years from these companies.
I agree.
And even intelligence matters.
Agree 100%. And I actually ran out of tough questions. You guys are better than I thought. So I want to open it to the audience. I don't know if Maddie agrees with that, but I want to hear from the audience because I'm sure there are some questions that they want to ask. And you can just come off mute, I think. Mm. Okay, so I guess no question.
Could I pose a question?
Who is speaking?
It's Alexis.
That's Alexis. Yeah.
Okay,
It's
yeah.
me.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
I'm curious around, AI governance, right? And so we really tried the thing called social media governance through the creation of Meta's Oversight Board, which really does just focus on content policy and doesn't focus on anything like the metaverse or um, really anything AI related. But what do we think about the creation of AI governance? I think it's something that civil society should really be a leader in. And I know this was mentioned in the EO, but I really think CSOs have the best opportunity to build something here and build something that's sustainable. So, Theo, David, sorry, but I just wanted to hear your thoughts there.
I think David has an answer.
No, actually, I got distracted by one of the questions that came up in the chat. So, Theo, you go ahead.
Admittedly, and I'm just going to click send. I was also responding to a question in the chat. Oh no. Alexis, incredible question. I didn't know that it was aimed at us.
AI governance. Should civil societies take the charge?
Oh,
Yeah, I mean, this is.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, Theo, you said something when we were talking a couple days ago about the UK summit and how civil society was like almost entirely excluded. And can you say more about that?
Yeah, so absolutely. So basically, I think CSOs, civil society organizations, as was mentioned earlier by somebody on this panel, I think maybe Sarah, it was you, that they really represent the public. And there's legitimacy to civil society voices that I think are incredibly important. They can also represent diverse constituencies that are generally underrepresented, specifically in technology governance conversations, particularly from the majority world. So this manifested in two ways that I observed in London in the last few weeks. One is that at the UK AI Safety Summit, really there was a overrepresentation of voices from the global north or the minority world. In part, that's because visas are hard to get to the UK. For folks who need visas, that can be a real obstacle. And so that is a logistical barrier to being in person in a space that was in person only for folks in this space. But also the reality is that the voices that weigh most heavily in the global conversation tend to be concentrated in North America and Western Europe. So I think additionally, on top of that, in terms of the 150-ish people that attended the event, only a minority of them were voices from civil society, just a few dozen. So I think there is this need to increase the representation of diverse civil society voices in these conversations because they are such legitimate actors. And that is happening to some extent, but I think should be happening more than it is. And of course, I'm a biased actor here. I work with a nonprofit partnership on AI. So I just want to call that out in my response as well.
Yeah, I'll just jump in. I also think civil society has a huge role to play in all of this. There's an international treaty that I first heard about a couple of months ago that's coming from the Council of Europe, and I didn't realize this. The Council of Europe, the European Council, and the Council of the European Union are three different things. But the Council of Europe, it predates the European Union, and they're working on an international AI treaty. Now, once I started reading more and asking around about this, I found out that treaty only applies to government uses of AI and does not include any private sector uses of AI as the current draft stands. And to me, that was quite shocking. Some of the biggest risks of AI will happen in the private sector, are already happening in the private sector. And as I learned more about that, I learned that there wasn't a transparent process for civil society to be able to observe the drafting or the lobbying that's going on behind the scenes to make that treaty happen. So any kind of new international treaties, international bodies, domestic bodies, mechanisms for regulating or governing AI need to be transparent so that civil society can take part in the construction of these important bodies. Otherwise, it's meaningless and illegitimate in my view.
I agree. Being mindful of time, there are two questions here that I am biased towards because I want to hear from you. I want to hear what you think about these two questions. So the first one is, and we can go with this one first. Are you concerned that AI regulations will put the US at a disadvantage, at a competitive disadvantage position compared to other countries, specifically China? So if you can quickly let me know your thoughts on that, and then we have time for one more question. David, you're muted. If you're
Alexis said it earlier, China's ahead of us on AI regulation. China's years ahead of us on regulating AI. And I don't, this is not an issue that keeps me up at night. I think China's tightly controlling AI. Chinese versions of ChatGPT can't insult the leadership of the government. I mean, they're censoring it in ways much more than anything we're doing. And so, no, I would not worry about that as an issue that's going to challenge American companies working in this field.
And it's
I love that perspective. But Alexis, go ahead.
Actually, I'm gonna plus one to David. I think the thing that sets us apart from China, right, it's like we have to take free speech into consideration, right? Like these are things like this is what happens when you live in a liberal democracy. So things are going to take a lot longer. China has had the upper hand in creating rules and regulations that no one has had to deliberate on. But what I would say is after the UK summit, you know, China is part of this compact of other countries that are focused on creating some universal standards around AI regulation. So while the answer is like, yes, China is ahead of us and strategic competition X, Y, and Z, it's not for the right reasons. And now we're in a place where we are working with 28 different countries, including China, on multilateral rules and standards. So I think that there's a lot more nuance there. But I mean, if anything, our competition would be the EU. But as you can look at the EO, a lot of what we see in the EO was taken from, and which is not a bad thing, lessons learned from what our partners have already created. So I'm not worried about China in this aspect.
Very interesting. Theo, anything you want to add?
Just a plus one and a note that at the recent UK AI Safety Summit, it was an intentional choice by the UK government to invite representatives of the Chinese government to participate, which I personally think was the right thing to do. I think we want to be in conversation with all stakeholders. I think it'll lead to better overall governance outcomes for everyone, but it was a controversial choice. Not everybody thought it was the right decision to include China in the summit, but they went with the more inclusive approach.
Which I agree with the right choice. Yeah, it's fun.
And we have 2 minutes left. So I want to ask 2 questions and you can choose which one you want to answer. So the first one is wondering if there are any thoughts on work that needs to be done at a more local level, like the municipal level, for example. And the other one is what kind of impact are you most excited about that the executive order stands to make? So you can choose which one you want to answer. So I'll go. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll go first. The answer is yes. There's so much to do at the municipal and state level. I used Colorado as an example earlier, but there are state legislators who are really concerned about AI that have the means and have the support within the state to actually push legislation. So there's so much to do, and there are a handful of states that are actually leading on this. And what I would also say is like working on the state level or even on the municipal level, even more locally, a lot of legislators have no idea what AI and tech is. They know how to tweet things, they know how to post things, but they don't know what it actually is. And so like there's also an opportunity to educate people who are going to run for higher office, but also be that person who says, okay, this is what this actually means, and this is what this means for the communities, and these are things that you should push for or look out for when you're creating legislation. So the answer is yes, and you can ping me. I have tons of ideas, but it's my 30-second.
Yeah, and states are the boss here. They go first. Theo, I think I see you're very excited to answer this.
Yeah, I love the word local. I run a small community nonprofit in the city where I live, Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is called Cambridge Local First and supports locally owned businesses, which have really struggled in so many different ways, both during and then also before the pandemic. And I think everything is local. And so I think 100% yes to your first question, that we really need to be mindful of what's happening at the state and local levels, because in many ways, these institutions get overlooked or have fewer resources, but are actually dealing with the problems on the ground, right? And so, like I won't go into too much detail, but in Cambridge, Massachusetts, right now, there is a huge discussion around manipulated media in a bunch of different contexts, and it's like tearing apart the city, unfortunately. So we are not immune from larger global conversations on issues like manipulated media and the like. So I think we want to set up our local institutions, both our small businesses, our local governments, and local nonprofits up for success so that they can take advantage of the opportunities that come with AI most effectively.
If I can just add very briefly, elections are run by states and counties, and I'm working right now with the Arizona Secretary of State's office to help them prepare for AI threats to the 2024 election. So something that states need to urgently do, because it's very unlikely that federal action is going to happen before the 2024 election, is states need to start figuring out their strategy for dealing with all of the AI threats coming their way.
I agree. And, it's not necessarily a bad thing that states take the lead on things, because many people say, well, what works for Tennessee may not work for California, may not work for Illinois. So I don't think it's a bad thing. It shows that the US is a very diverse, big country. So I don't see anything wrong with that. Unfortunately, we are at time. We're actually past time. So I want to thank the panelists for putting up with my hardball questions and answering them so well. And I